6 months later, Maria Santos stood on the front porch of the Morrison Ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the Texas sky in shades of pink and gold. In her arms, Diego gurgled happily, his cheeks now round and healthy, his eyes bright with curiosity about the world around him. The thin, desperate baby who had cried from hunger in the grass was now a thriving 8-month-old who laughed at the ranch dogs and clapped his hands when the horses came near the fence. The small apartment over the barn had become more than just a place to live. It was home in a way Maria had never experienced before. Ruth had helped her paint the walls a soft yellow, and Frank had built shelves for Diego's growing collection of toys. The Morrisons' children had sent boxes of baby clothes and supplies when they heard about their newest family addition, because that's what Maria and Diego had become, family. Maria's days now followed a comfortable rhythm. She woke early to help Ruth with breakfast, then spent the morning cleaning the main house while Diego napped or played in his portable crib. The work was honest and fulfilling, nothing like the impersonal factory job she'd lost. Here, she could see the difference her efforts made, could take pride in the way the old house gleamed under her care. In the afternoons, while Diego slept, Maria often helped Ruth in the garden or assisted Frank with lighter ranch duties. She'd learned to collect eggs from the chickens, to identify which cows might need medical attention, and even to ride Blue, the horse who had first brought her to safety. Frank had insisted on teaching her, saying that anyone living on a ranch needed to know basic horsemanship. But the greatest change was in Maria herself. The fear that had driven her for so long was gradually being replaced by something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope. For the first time since Diego's birth, she could think beyond just surviving to the next day. She was saving money from her wages, slowly building a foundation for their future. Ruth had become more than an employer. She was the mother figure Maria had lost when she left home, offering advice about raising Diego, sharing stories about her own children's milestones, and providing the kind of steady support Maria had never had before. When Diego ran his first fever, Ruth sat up with them all night, monitoring his temperature and reassuring Maria that this was normal, that babies got sick and recovered, that she was doing everything right. Frank had proven to be an unexpected mentor. His quiet wisdom and steady presence reminded Maria of her grandfather, who had died when she was 12. Frank taught her about budgeting and saving money, about planning for the future instead of just reacting to crisis. He helped her open her first real bank account and showed her how to read financial documents she'd never understood before. Most importantly, both Ruth and Frank treated Diego like their own grandchild. They celebrated his first tooth, cheered when he started crawling, and Frank even built him a special high chair for family dinners. Diego responded to their love with infectious joy, becoming the kind of happy, confident baby that strangers smiled at in the grocery store. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Maria still sometimes woke at night, panicked by dreams of being hungry and homeless again. There were moments when she caught herself hoarding food, unable to quite believe that meals would always be available. And she struggled with accepting help, having learned early that kindness often came with hidden costs. But the Morrisons were patient with her fears and consistent in their support. When Maria tried to return part of her first paycheck, insisting it was too much for someone with no formal training, Ruth had sat her down for a serious conversation. "Maria," Ruth had said, "you work harder than any housekeeper we've ever had. You care for this place like it's your own. And you've brought life back into this house in a way Frank and I didn't even realize we were missing. You've more than earned every penny." The conversation had continued with Ruth sharing how empty the house had felt after their youngest child left for college, how the daily routines had lost their meaning when there was no one to nurture and guide. Diego's presence had given them purpose again, and Maria's grateful heart had shown them how much they'd taken for granted. As the months passed, Maria began to dream again. She enrolled in online classes to get her GED, studying in the evenings while Diego slept. Ruth helped with the coursework, particularly the math and science that gave Maria trouble. Frank contributed by sharing practical knowledge about business and economics that no textbook could teach. "Education is the one thing nobody can ever take away from you," Ruth had said when Maria expressed doubts about her ability to succeed. And Diego needs to see his mother fighting for a better future. The comment had motivated Maria like nothing else could. She wanted her son to grow up knowing that obstacles could be overcome, that hard work and good people could change everything. She wanted him to learn that accepting help wasn't weakness, but wisdom, and that gratitude should be expressed through action rather than just words. Diego was thriving in ways that went beyond physical health. Surrounded by love and stability, he was developing the secure attachment that psychologists said was crucial for future relationships. He laughed easily, explored confidently, and showed no fear of new people or situations. The contrast with the desperate infant crying in the grass was so complete that sometimes Maria could hardly believe they were the same person. The ranch itself was flourishing under the combined efforts of the expanded family. With Maria handling the household responsibilities, Ruth could focus more attention on the medical needs of both the animals and the neighboring families who relied on her nursing expertise. Frank could dedicate more time to the cattle operation, which was having its most profitable year in recent memory. But perhaps the most significant change was in the way the Morrisons approached life. Having Maria and Diego in their daily routine reminded them to notice and appreciate small moments. Diego's first attempts at walking, Maria's excitement over passing a particularly difficult exam, the simple pleasure of sharing meals with people who had become precious to them. One evening in late autumn, as they sat on the front porch watching Diego play with blocks while Ruth knitted and Frank read his agricultural journals, Maria finally found the words to express what had been growing in her heart for months. "I can never repay you for what you've done for us," she said quietly, not wanting to interrupt the peaceful scene but needing to speak the truth. Frank looked up from his magazine, and Ruth paused her knitting. They both smiled at her with the kind of warm affection usually reserved for family members. "Maria," Frank said gently, "the day I found you and Diego by that fence was one of the best days of this old rancher's life. You didn't just get help from us. You gave us exactly what we needed too." Ruth nodded agreement, reaching over to squeeze Maria's hand. "Sometimes the people we think we're rescuing are actually the ones rescuing us." As if sensing the emotional moment, Diego crawled over to Maria and pulled himself up against her legs, babbling in his own language while looking proudly at the adults who made up his world. Maria picked him up and settled him on her lap, marveling again at how much their lives had changed. The highway where she'd once walked in desperation was visible in the distance, a ribbon of asphalt where hundreds of people passed every day, most of them too busy to notice anything beyond their immediate destinations. Maria sometimes wondered about other travelers in crisis who might be walking that road, hoping someone would stop, someone would care enough to help. That's why she and Ruth had started volunteering at the women's shelter in town, and why Frank had begun carrying extra water and snacks in his truck when he drove the ranch roads. They knew firsthand how quickly circumstances could change, how thin the line was between stability and crisis, and how much difference one person's compassion could make. Diego fell asleep in Maria's arms as the sun set behind the pastures, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The evening was warm and peaceful, filled with the sounds of cattle settling for the night and the distant call of a nighthawk. It was the kind of moment that people remember years later when they need to believe in goodness again. As Maria carried her sleeping son inside, she paused to look back at the grass where Frank had found them 6 months earlier. The spot was barely visible now in the gathering darkness, but she knew exactly where it was. Sometimes she walked there during Diego's afternoon naps, not from sadness but from gratitude, remembering how close they had come to disaster and how completely their lives had been transformed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. Diego would continue growing and learning. Maria would advance in her studies and inch closer to her goal of eventually starting her own small business. The ranch would face the changing seasons and the eternal cycles of agricultural life. But tonight, as she tucked Diego into his crib in their cozy apartment and looked out at the lights of the main house where Frank and Ruth were probably settling in for the evening, Maria felt something she'd never experienced before in her young life. Complete security in the knowledge that she and her son belonged somewhere, were valued and loved, and had a future full of possibilities. The cowboy's quiet gesture that day had indeed changed everything. But not just for Maria and Diego. It had reminded the Morrison family of the profound satisfaction that comes from opening your heart and home to people in need. It had created bonds stronger than blood relationships and built a foundation of trust that would last for generations. And somewhere out on the highway, another traveler might be walking in desperation, hoping for the same kind of miracle that had saved Maria and Diego. But now there were more people watching, more hearts ready to respond, because kindness, like hope, had a way of multiplying when it was shared. Maria stared at Frank Morrison, hardly daring to believe what she'd heard. A nurse? His wife was a nurse? It felt like a miracle after 2 days of rejection and closed doors. But years of disappointment had taught her to be careful about getting her hopes up. "I don't have money to pay," she said quietly, bouncing Diego gently as his whimpering continued. "I can work, though. I'm strong, and I know how to clean, cook." Frank was already walking toward the gate in the fence, pulling out a set of keys. "We'll figure all that out later. Right now, let's get this baby some help." The gate swung open with a rusty creak, and Frank gestured for Maria to come through. She hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the highway where she'd planned to continue hitching rides. But Diego let out another weak cry, and the decision was made. She stepped onto Morrison Ranch property, following Frank toward his waiting horse. "Can you ride?" he asked, patting the horse's neck. "Old Blue here is gentle as they come, and it's about a half-mile to the house." Maria shook her head. She'd grown up in the city and had never been close to a horse, much less ridden one. Frank nodded understanding and reached for his radio, the kind ranchers used to communicate across long distances. "Ruth, you there?" His voice crackled through the static. A woman's voice answered immediately, warm and clear. "I'm here, Frank. What's going on?" "Got a young mother and baby out here by the south fence. Baby sounds dehydrated and hungry. Can you meet us at the house with some formula and your nursing kit?" There was a pause. Then Ruth's voice came back, more serious now. "How old's the baby?" Frank looked at Maria questioningly. 3 months, she answered. 3 months old, Frank relayed. "Mother looks pretty worn out too. I'll have everything ready. Bring them straight to the kitchen." Frank clipped the radio back to his belt and turned to Maria with a reassuring smile. "Ruth's been a nurse for 35 years. If anyone can help your boy, it's her." They started walking toward the ranch buildings, Frank leading his horse while Maria carried Diego. The dirt road was easier on her feet than the rough ground she'd been traveling, but every step still sent pain shooting up her legs. Frank noticed her limping and slowed his pace. "My truck's in the barn," he said. "Should have thought of that first." "I'm okay," Maria insisted, though she clearly wasn't. Pride was sometimes all a person had left, and Frank understood that. He'd been poor once too, back when he and Ruth were first married and trying to make a go of ranching with nothing but determination and a handful of cattle. As they walked, Frank found himself thinking about his own children. His oldest daughter lived in Houston now, working as a teacher. His son managed a hardware store in town. His youngest, Sarah, was finishing college in Austin. All of them successful and secure, but he remembered when they were babies, how helpless and dependent they'd been. "Where were you heading?" he asked gently, trying to keep Maria talking. He'd noticed she was swaying slightly as she walked, and he wanted to make sure she stayed alert. "San Antonio," Maria replied, shifting Diego to her other arm. "I have a friend there who might help me find work. Long way to walk with a baby. I had rides part way, but the last truck broke down, and nobody else would stop." Her voice carried no bitterness, just tired acceptance of reality. Frank felt a familiar anger rise in his chest at the thought of people driving past a woman with a baby. But he kept his voice calm. "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters." The ranch house came into view as they crested a small hill. It was a sprawling, single-story building that had clearly been added onto over the years. The original part was built of local stone, weathered gray by decades of Texas weather. Newer sections showed the pine siding Frank had added when the children were young and needed more space. A large front porch wrapped around 2 sides of the house, with rocking chairs and hanging plants that Ruth tended with loving care. Shade trees, carefully cultivated over many years, provided relief from the relentless sun. It looked like the kind of place where people lived long, comfortable lives surrounded by family. As they approached the front steps, the door opened, and Ruth Morrison emerged. She was a woman in her late 50s with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her face was kind but alert, the expression of someone accustomed to dealing with medical emergencies. She wore a clean white blouse and jeans, and carried a medical bag that had clearly seen years of use. "Oh my," Ruth said softly as she got her first good look at Maria and Diego. Her trained eyes immediately assessed the situation: the mother's obvious dehydration and exhaustion, the baby's weak crying, the way they both looked like they'd been traveling hard for days. "Let's get you both inside," she said, stepping forward to guide Maria up the steps. "I've got formula warming and some electrolyte solution ready." The inside of the Morrison house was cool and welcoming. The kitchen was large and comfortable, with a big wooden table that looked like it had hosted thousands of family meals. Ruth guided Maria to a chair and gently took Diego from her arms. "Hello there, little one," she murmured, immediately beginning a quick assessment. She checked his reflexes, looked at his eyes and mouth, felt his fontanelle. Maria watched anxiously as the older woman examined her son with gentle, practiced hands. "He's dehydrated, but not critically," Ruth announced after a few minutes. "We caught it in time. And you, honey, when did you last eat?" "2 days ago," Maria admitted. "I had some crackers and water." Ruth and Frank exchanged a look. "Frank, start some soup heating," Ruth instructed. "The chicken and rice from yesterday. And bring some of those rolls from the freezer." While Frank moved around the kitchen with surprising efficiency for such a large man, Ruth prepared a bottle of formula. She tested the temperature on her wrist, then settled into a chair next to Maria. "Would you like to feed him, or would you prefer I do it?" she asked gently. Maria's eyes filled with tears. For 2 days, she'd felt like such a failure as a mother, unable to provide the most basic need for her child. "Could you?" "I'm afraid my hands are shaking too much." Ruth took Diego and positioned him expertly in her arms. The moment the bottle touched his lips, the baby began sucking eagerly, his tiny hands grasping at the bottle. The sound of his hungry gulping filled the quiet kitchen. "There we go," Ruth murmured. "That's what you needed, wasn't it, sweetheart?" Maria watched her son feed, tears of relief streaming down her face. The fear that had been gnawing at her for days began to ease as she saw Diego's strength returning with each ounce of formula. Frank set a bowl of steaming soup in front of Maria, along with a plate of warm rolls and butter. "Ruth makes the best chicken soup in 3 counties," he said with obvious pride in his wife. The soup was indeed wonderful, rich and nourishing, with tender pieces of chicken and vegetables that had been simmered for hours. Maria tried to eat slowly, to be polite, but her body's need for nutrition overrode her manners. Ruth noticed and quietly placed a second bowl beside the first. "Don't you worry about eating fast," Ruth said kindly. "Your body knows what it needs." As Maria ate and Diego continued drinking his bottle, Frank and Ruth exchanged quiet conversation at the other end of the kitchen. Maria couldn't hear everything, but she caught enough to understand they were discussing what to do next. She felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach, wondering if their kindness would end with this meal. But when Ruth returned to check on Diego, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms, her expression was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Maria," Ruth said gently, "Frank tells me you were heading to San Antonio to look for work." "Yes, ma'am. I have a friend there who works at a hotel. She said she might be able to help me find something." "What kind of work did you do before the baby came?" "Factory work mostly. But I can clean, cook, take care of children. I'm not afraid of hard work." Ruth looked at Frank, who nodded slightly. They seemed to communicate without words, the way couples do after decades of marriage. "Well," Ruth said finally, "it so happens we could use some help around here. Our regular housekeeper moved to be closer to her grandchildren last month, and I've been trying to keep up with everything myself." Maria's heart jumped, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What kind of help?" "General housekeeping, some cooking, laundry. Nothing too difficult, but it's a big house, and Frank tracks in half the ranch every day." Ruth smiled at her husband, who grinned back sheepishly. The thing is, Frank added, settling into a chair across from Maria, the job comes with a place to stay. There's a small apartment over the barn that we fixed up for our son when he was in high school. It's got its own kitchen and bathroom, completely private. Maria stared at them both, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. A job, a place to live, and people who had shown more kindness in one afternoon than she'd encountered in weeks. I don't have references, she said quietly. And I can't pay you anything up front. Honey, Ruth interrupted gently. Sometimes life is about taking chances on people. You seem like good people who've hit a rough patch. We've all been there. Frank nodded agreement. Besides, Blue there took to you right away, and he's usually suspicious of strangers. That horse is a better judge of character than most people I know. Maria Santos clutched her 3-month-old son closer to her chest as another sharp pain shot through her empty stomach. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty roadside where she sat, hidden behind tall prairie grass that swayed in the hot wind. Her baby, little Diego, had been crying for hours now, his tiny fists waving desperately as he searched for milk that simply wasn't there. She had been walking for 2 days straight after the old pickup truck that gave her a ride broke down 50 miles from nowhere. The driver, a kind farmer heading to market, had apologized profusely but couldn't afford to fix his engine. He gave her his last $10 and pointed toward the distant highway, promising that someone would surely help a young mother with a baby. But nobody had stopped. Dozens of cars and trucks roared past, their drivers either too busy or too suspicious to pull over for a young Hispanic woman walking alone with an infant. Maria's feet were raw and bleeding inside her worn sneakers, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. The small bottle of water she'd started with was empty by noon on the first day. Now, as the afternoon sun climbed higher, Diego's cries grew weaker, which scared Maria more than when they were loud and demanding. She knew what it meant when babies stopped crying from hunger. Her own mother had told her stories of the hard times, when families had to make impossible choices just to survive. Maria had left her hometown of Brownsville with such hope just 4 months ago. The factory job in Dallas promised good money, enough to send back to her sick mother and maybe even save for a little apartment. But when Diego arrived earlier than expected, everything changed. The factory wouldn't hold her position, and the boarding house where she'd been staying wouldn't allow crying babies. She tried calling her cousin in Austin, but his phone was disconnected. The church shelter in the last town was full, and the social services office told her there was a 3-week waiting list for emergency assistance. With only $47 to her name and no one to turn to, Maria made the desperate decision to hitchhike to San Antonio, where her friend Carmen worked as a hotel maid and might have a couch to spare. The grass around her rustled as a hot breeze picked up, carrying the scent of cattle and dust. In the distance, she could see a ranch gate and a long dirt road leading to a cluster of buildings. The sight gave her a flicker of hope. Ranch people were supposed to be good people, weren't they? Maybe they would at least let her fill her water bottle or give Diego some milk. But as she started to stand, her legs trembled and gave way. The 2 days of walking on almost no food had drained her strength completely. She settled back down in the grass, pulling Diego closer as his whimpering grew softer. Tears rolled down her dusty cheeks as she realized she might not be able to protect her son after all. That's when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the ranch. Through the grass, she could see a figure on horseback moving slowly along the fence line, checking posts and gates. Maria's heart raced. Should she call out? What if the person was angry about trespassers? What if they called the police? But Diego chose that moment to let out another weak cry, and Maria knew she had no choice left. Her baby's life was more important than her fear. She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly, and stepped out from behind the tall grass just as the rider came into view. The cowboy on the horse was an older man, maybe 60, with silver hair visible beneath his worn hat. His face was weathered and serious, the kind of face that had seen both hardship and joy over many years. He wore a faded blue work shirt and jeans that had clearly seen countless days of ranch work. When he spotted Maria standing there with the baby, he immediately pulled his horse to a stop. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the fence. Maria could see surprise in his eyes, but also something else, concern, maybe even compassion. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "You all right out there?" Maria opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. Her throat was too dry, and suddenly, everything felt overwhelming. The fear, the hunger, the desperate love she felt for her crying son, it all hit her at once. She sank to her knees in the grass, holding Diego protectively against her chest. The cowboy dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. He approached the fence slowly, his hands visible, making no sudden movements that might frighten her. Maria noticed he kept his distance, respecting her space even as concern creased his weathered features. "When's the last time you ate something?" he asked gently, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who'd lived in Texas his whole life. Maria finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "2 days ago. My baby, he needs milk. I don't have any money for formula." The cowboy's expression softened immediately. He looked at the crying infant, then back at Maria's exhausted face. Without hesitation, he walked back to his horse and pulled something from his saddlebag. Maria watched as he returned to the fence with a thermos and what looked like a paper bag. "I've got some coffee here, and my wife packed me extra sandwiches today," he said, setting them on the fence post nearest to where Maria sat. "Name's Frank Morrison. This is my ranch you're sitting next to." "I'm sorry," Maria said quickly, struggling to stand again. "I didn't mean to trespass. I was just resting, and the grass was cool." Frank held up a hand to stop her apology. "No harm done. You look like you could use some help, and that little one sounds mighty hungry." Diego's cries were getting weaker again, which made both adults look at him with growing concern. Frank's face grew serious as he studied the situation. This wasn't just about a tired traveler needing a meal. This was about a baby whose life might be in danger. "How long has he been crying like that?" Frank asked, his voice gentle but urgent. "Since yesterday morning," Maria admitted, her voice breaking. "I've been trying to nurse him, but I don't think I have enough milk anymore. I haven't been eating enough to." She didn't need to finish. Frank understood immediately. He'd raised 3 children of his own, and he knew what a hungry baby sounded like. More importantly, he knew what happened when babies didn't get the nutrition they needed. The afternoon sun continued to beat down on them as Frank made a decision that would change everything. He looked at Maria, then at little Diego, and then back at his ranch house visible in the distance. His wife Ruth would be starting dinner soon, and their youngest son's old baby things were still stored in the attic. But it wasn't just about having the resources to help. Frank Morrison had been raised to believe that when you saw someone in need, especially a mother with a baby, you didn't hesitate. You did what was right, and you figured out the details later. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I think you and your boy better come up to the house. My wife's a nurse, and she'll know what to do for the little one."